Good morning, members of the press present here today, as well as our viewers watching via the DA's live stream. My name is Marshally Fredericks. I'm the DA's National Communications Manager, and today the party will be presenting its alternative budget as well as our proposals for the Finance Minister ahead of his maiden budget speech on Wednesday. With me, I have the DA Shadow Minister of Finance, Dr. Dion George, as well as the DA Shadow Deputy Minister of Finance, Ashor Sarupen. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand over to you, Dion.
Good morning and welcome to the DA's alternative budget. Budgeting for jobs, accelerating growth and fighting poverty. Thank you for joining us. The DA's alternative medium-term budget policy statement in October 2021 proposed a fiscal policy platform for a post-pandemic economic resilience that would enable prudent fiscal management, unlock economic growth, disrupt high levels of unemployment, and alleviate the disproportionate impact of rising inflationary pressures on the poor. The policy imperatives of these key deliverables have not changed and provide the framework for the DA's alternative budget for 2022. Achieving economic growth that generates jobs, especially after the devastating effects of a global pandemic, will test the mettle of our collective national resolve. It is a challenge that we have to confront head-on if we are to address the staggering levels of unemployment and increasing poverty amongst vulnerable groups in our country. The DA's 2022 alternative budget presents how a DA government will reverse the upward debt spiral by containing debt and managing expenditure, attract investment capital and encourage savings to accelerate economic growth, stimulate economic growth enablers by ensuring energy and water security, attracting retired educators back into the system, and reforming state-owned enterprises for private investment. Fight corruption by making an exception to our commitment to no new taxes or tax increases by imposing a punitive corruption tax. Protect vulnerable South Africans by introducing a conditional basic income grant, supporting small, medium and micro business enterprises in particular, and leveraging pension fund assets to the benefit of fund members. The DA continues to emphasize the importance of foster economic growth to address staggering levels of unemployment, unsustainably high debt, and growing poverty levels. To unlock the growth dividend, our economy should be opened up to more private investment and innovation. I will now hand over to Ashor.
Thank you very much, Dion. So for the first time since South Africa's democratic transition, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have extended emergency loans to South Africa with a combined total of 76 billion rand. Although treasurers try to justify these loans as concessionary with low interest rates and necessary to stave off the socio-economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the reality is that this government is unable to meet its spending obligations from the fiscal balance sheet and now has been forced to borrow from international finance institutions. Failure to take the necessary steps now to address the growing national debt crisis, restore economic growth, and the conditions necessary to create jobs will push South Africa further into the debt embrace of the IMF and the World Bank, this time for loans with more onerous conditions. The DA will reintroduce our Fiscal Responsibility Bill to bring the national debt under control and introduce a statutory fiscal rule for the first time. Through targeted spending cuts and savings, the DA's debt containment model shows that our national debt can be brought under control sooner and at a lower rate than the ANC government's stated objectives. I will now hand back to Dion.
In order to move beyond the lethargic growth rates of the past decade and unlock growth levels that will open up opportunity for economic participation among South Africans, the DA proposes to attract investment and encourage savings through reducing regulation and oversight levies for the financial sector, raising the threshold on taxes on interest earned to 500,000, tax relief on rental income for individual taxpayers, increase annual tax-free savings limit to 100,000 rand, scrap remaining exchange controls, cut fuel on tax. The DA believes that part of the intervention needed to improve South Africa's fixed income investment indicator is through investment relief. Companies that, for example, invest between 10 billion and 12 billion in our economy should be given time-bound tax breaks. These tax breaks should also be accompanied by practical interventions to provide policy certainty and economic structural reform. For investment capital to flow, the investment climate must be attractive. Barriers to doing business must be lowered, and individual savings must be encouraged. To fund the tax cuts contained in the DA's alternative budget, we propose the following. On procurement, prices paid by government departments must be open to public scrutiny and checked against what is readily available at retail and wholesale level. Reward budget savings. Use it or lose it is a perverse incentive that results in unnecessary wasteful expenditure. Budget savings should be rewarded where appropriate. Expenditure efficiency benchmarks should be used to improve departmental performance. Department relevancy tests or assessments. Where these departments overspend, we must be very clear where that is, and there should also be some departments that can be scrapped, resulting in budget savings. The DA has previously argued that 15 core departments are enough to meet the administrative and governance needs of South Africa. We need real action on corruption. The DA will soon be introducing a private members' bill in Parliament to initiate a corruption tax. The private members' bill will amend the Tax Administration Act and introduce provisions that will require that any company or organisation implicated in corruption pay an additional percentage of company tax above the company's corporate tax rate. I will now hand over to Ashor.
Thank you. As Dion discussed in the introduction, we have identified some economic enablers, and the first of these is energy. And while the DA welcomes the announcement made by the President in his State of the Nation address to establish an electricity transmission company, we're opposed to the idea that it be made a state-controlled Eskom subsidiary. What South Africa needs is an independent transmission and market operator, which will be responsible for the system operation and the purchase of electricity from electricity generators. On water security, in order to improve water quality infrastructure and reverse the existing backlog in infrastructure maintenance, there is an urgent need to progressively increase public investment in water infrastructure as a percentage of GDP. Ensure that a Treasury-determined percentage of government grants to municipalities is spent on operational expenditure to manage existing infrastructure, especially outdated water reticulation systems. Open the water sector to private sector investment by allowing municipalities in good financial standing to enter into public-private partnerships for infrastructure investments. We believe that we should be attracting retired teachers, and as part of the interventions to recover the learning and teaching time lost and to address the high vacancy rate in the education sector, the DA proposes that government hires retired educators to fill the gap. The DA sets an initial investment of 3 billion rand to fund this initiative. Then lastly, we believe that we should ready SOEs for private investment. The President's announcement that preparatory work has begun for the establishment of an overarching state-owned holding company to house all commercial SOEs was not only ill-informed, but does nothing to solve the current systemic challenges affecting these entities. Instead of creating a new SOE to manage the bankrupt SOEs, the government should be readying them for private sector investments. And only a systematic program of private sector participation will remove SOEs from being a burden on the fiscus and the taxpayer and make them more competitive on the market. I'll now hand back to Dion.
Thank you, Ashor. The poor and vulnerable continue to shoulder most of the economic burden from the disruption caused by COVID-19 and lack of growth in our economy. As such, government spending on direct cash support for the poor should be protected from cuts. With the savings realized from the DA's targeted spending cuts and savings, the DA commits to protecting inflationary increases in social grants. This would entail social grant increases in excess of 30 billion rand over 3 years. The DA has been a long-standing supporter of the idea of income support for the unemployed. Our view is that a basic income grant will provide an economic floor for the most vulnerable, as well as put money directly into the hands of the people who are best placed to decide where to spend it. The market makes better allocative decisions than the government. However, we are concerned that the country simply cannot afford to support a growing number of dependents in an environment of low growth. and a shrinking revenue base. It would seem, therefore, that a basic income grant would become increasingly feasible as an expenditure from the proceeds of growth as opposed to increased taxes. As economic growth is realized, a basic income grant would become affordable. The DA has budgeted an additional 105 billion rand over the next 3 years for the introduction of a conditional basic income grant. The grant would be made available on the understanding that it would only be provided when revenue generated from GDP growth is available. It would not be funded from additional tax. To unlock the growth dividend through small, medium and micro enterprises, the DEA proposes the following: the expansion of tax-free savings, especially into SMME companies, by allowing more types of products into tax-free accounts; better targeted tax incentives into venture capital and early-stage companies; tax relief or tax holidays for startups and SMMEs. This also includes employees of the startup so that the necessary skills are more affordable as part of the business setup costs. Full BEE scorecard exemptions for startups, upgrading the contribution level to level 1 from level 4 for exempt SMMEs, assuming that BEE legislation is retained at all, given that the DA does not support this legislation. Raise the threshold for what is classified as a micro-enterprise to 50 million rand turnover, a small enterprise to 500 million turnover, and a medium enterprise 2 billion rand turnover. Comprehensive relief for startups. On pension fund assets, a significant amount of investment capital is owned by pension fund members. To fund its developmental state model, government aims to encourage funds to invest members' money in infrastructure projects in the hope that this will create jobs. Pension fund members should be permitted to leverage their own pension fund assets as collateral for a pension-backed loan and be able to access a portion of their pension fund before retirement. This two-tier system will enable a balance between current and future consumption to the benefit of hardworking South Africans. The DA is fully aware that economic reform cannot occur overnight. After decades of policy incoherence, economic damage caused by failed triple BEE interventions, public financial mismanagement, and high levels of corruption, an economic turnaround will require time and effort. The DA firmly believes that a pathway to prosperity for all South Africans is possible. Thank you to my colleagues. Marshall, back to you.
Thank you so much, Dion and Ashor. I'm going to open up for questions. I just want to remind the media that's viewing via our live stream that you can just send your questions to me directly. My contact details is on the DA's WhatsApp group. So I'm going to open up for questions. Okay. You can go ahead. Your name and your media house, please.
Yes, from Film 24. I've got.
Just hold on a second. We just want to get the mic. There you go.
Thank you very much. Kulegan Magubana from Film 24. I've got two, if that's okay. Just wanted the MPs to unpack the systemic program for private sector participation and how they would envisage that, if there's any, test case models of best practice around the world that might invoke this idea that they've mentioned, with a bit of mention on what are probably your most cynical worst case scenario expectations in terms of what the minister says about SOEs and supporting them on Wednesday, given the fact that during the medium term he didn't give anything except for money to Denel, which was government guaranteed in any case. And secondly would be the question of business support. There's a lot of emphasis in here of that. In terms of taxes especially, we know that the National Liquor Traders Association is asking for a 0% increase on excise. Where does the DA see that, and what would that mean for supporting small business? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll go to a second question, and then we'll do another round afterwards. Over here in the front.
Yes, good afternoon, Linda Ensor, Business Day. I'd like to just hear what you propose should be done with the tax overrun, which is estimated between 120 and 200 billion rand. Some of that obviously will go for the social relief of distress grant, but that will leave substantial. Should that be used to pay off debt, or how would you propose that be used? Also, just perhaps if you could answer give more details about this corruption tax. And isn't it rather a blanket measure where someone who's been corrupt of 20 million rand and someone who's corrupt for 2 billion rand would suffer the same consequence? And then lastly, have you done any costing of the tax measures that you propose, such as the 100,000 tax-free savings limit? Thanks.
Thank you. Ungisa, just get the mic. I'm going to hand over to you, Dion, and then Ashor.
Thank you very much for your questions. On the private sector participation, now we have seen models throughout the world that don't work. For example, in Russia, when it was decided that the state-owned enterprises would be offloaded, you had a huge amount of corruption and a few people got exceptionally rich. When we're talking about private sector participation, is that we know that there's a lot of skill in the private sector. The private sector is sitting on a pile of cash of about 1 trillion rand. What we want to do is to unlock that into the economy. And that's the biggest participation that the private sector can do. So creating an environment that will attract this money into the economy is what we are talking about. Also, specifically when we're looking at the state-owned enterprises, we've said that over and over again that it's important to inject the private sector into those entities. They're hopelessly bankrupt. Now we're going to have another big one that's going to oversee all the bankrupt enterprises. It makes no sense. So what the idea would be is to inject private sector expertise into these entities so that they would not only bring capital, but also bring the expertise that perhaps makes some of them work, and if they don't work, to actually shut them down. On the SMMEs also, I mean, crucially, we know that the only generator of jobs in South Africa, virtually the only one, is the small business sector. You see, especially with COVID, lots of small businesses have fallen over. What the idea would be now is to encourage them to survive and to flourish. So the idea would be that if you provide tax relief to the smaller businesses, they will then be able to start a virtuous cycle and possibly get people who are in the informal sector into the formal sector so that we can actually tax that sector. We know how big the informal sector is, and no tax is generated off that. On the liquor trade, yes, we know that the liquor trade has had quite a difficult time, especially under COVID when there was the nonsensical regulations, the prohibition on the liquor trade, and they were very, very badly damaged. So I do think that it is necessary to provide some kind of relief. In terms of the detail of what that relief should be, whether it should be 0% on excise, I think that should be looked at closely. But I do think that when every single year we see the minister or the various ministers as they come increase taxes on so-called sin taxes, perhaps we should think again on those, especially given the smack that industry received, and others did as well. On the tax overrun, yes, that's always a very important question, because if you have a temporary bump in your revenue, you can't just go and have long-term spending. So I do agree that a portion of it should be spent on social relief of distress. I think that's actually a fortunate windfall, because we do need to support vulnerable people. And so I do think that is a useful way. In terms of paying off debt, we know how high the debt levels are. The DA's view is that we should be reducing debt. I think that, well, depending on how much money we have available, I do think it's also important that we should look closely at infrastructure, especially those enablers of economic growth. So, for example, if we look in the energy sector, we look at water, for example, that is a massive big item now. We are a water-scarce country, and as we battle with that, it starts to shrink our economy. So I would do a combination. Obviously, there's only so much money, but I would provide social support where possible. I would pay off debt where possible, and also inject money into infrastructure. You can't only rely on pension funds for that, because that is not going to work. On the corruption tax, that is quite a fascinating subject all on its own, but the idea would be is that we know that there are companies who have been implicated in corruption in South Africa, and that has been extremely bad for our country. It has been extremely bad for every citizen in it. And so I think that the people that have suffered from it should get some benefit from that. So a corruption tax, where a company, for example, is guilty of corruption, charge them extra tax. And I think if you hit people in their pocket, they will think twice before they do that again. In terms of small versus large, I think the idea would be that it would be a percentage, for example, maybe on turnover or what percentage they pay. Obviously, the detail would have to be thrashed out as that legislation starts to roll. But the key thing is, and I think that's important because sentiment matters, the key message out there is to say South Africa is open for business and we do not tolerate corruption and we will take action where necessary. Because what you're trying to do is create a stable environment to attract investment because we have competitors all over the world. On the tax-free limit, yes, I did in fact do some costing on that. It's an extremely small number. That's why I didn't even factor it in. The fact is that very few people in South Africa are incentivized to save. There's this argument that South Africa does not have a culture of saving. That is actually untrue. If you look, for example, at the stokvels, for example, that have been in existence for a very long time, South Africans understand very well how to save, but they're not incentivized to save. So you have tax that gets in the way of the saving. And the idea is really there's only two ways that you can grow our economy. You can attract investment capital from the various places it comes from, including abroad, and you can encourage domestic saving. And if you do that, you have more capital available in the economy so that it can be invested for growth. So what the idea is to remove those barriers to saving and encourage people. And also, as we said on the tax-free savings, expand that. So, for example, if you're investing in a small business, for example, that you can also get some kind of tax relief. And that's the whole idea, is to build a package on that. Ashor, I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
Just on the question around what are the most cynical expectations for SOEs, last week in the Appropriations Committee, it basically came to light that the Land Bank has still not concluded its negotiations with its creditors after defaulting. And of course, they've lost most of their senior executives now as well. So executive instability, I suspect, is going to be dragging that out. The Post Office has asked for an additional 20 billion rand. The South African Airways, since resuming operations, has lost 500 million rand. So you want my cynical take on this, and I'll give you my cynical take, and that is that we will not see major allocations to SOEs. What we will see is what they've done in previous financial years, which is they'll put in a large contingency reserve, 10, maybe 15, maybe a bit more, billion rands. And then when they do the adjustment budget, they will appropriate from the contingency reserve to bail out SOEs. It's been the trick they pull in and year out. So in the main budget speech, they say no bailouts, but then when it comes down to crunch time, in the course of the financial year, you do get a bailout. Then with regards to the corruption tax, most of our ideas are modeled by the ideas put forward by Sean Gossel, who's at the UCT Graduate School of Business, and his data is in the public domain, and I suggest you have a look at that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dion and Ashor. I just want to check if there are any further questions. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Atim Tana from Newsroom Africa. I think my colleagues have covered me on the corruption tax issue. But what I want to get from you as well is, given the fact that the country has a very high unemployment rate affecting young people, what informed this decision to propose the return of retired teachers at a cost of, 3 billion?
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, then I'll hand over to you, Dion.
I think crucially, if you look at our economy, what we need in the economy is we need capital and we need skilled people to make sure that we can grow. Our education system has not been functioning as it should function. And the idea would be to say, don't lose the skills that we already had in the system that have left for example, early retirement, etc. That teachers that are, educators that are currently available to come back into the system, let them do that. I think we worked out it was about 10,000 teachers in that range that we would be able to attract back for that relatively small amount of money. But the idea would be that if you can improve education across our entire system, you would have a better equipped person to go into the job, into the workplace. Also, if you roll back, what is the basic role of government? The basic role of government is to provide the services that will enable people to have a good and functional life. So if you provide a decent, basic kind of education to everybody, irrespective of where they come from, they've got such a better chance. And that's why we felt that investing in education in particular, and it's a relatively small amount of money because there's only so much that's available, that would at least go some way to better equipping everybody. Because what is the greatest benefit South Africa has? One of our strategic advantages is we have a young population. And it would be an absolute tragedy if we don't properly equip that young population with the ideas, with a good education, so that they will build us. That, in my view, is one of our strongest competitive advantages, and that's why we've put it there as well. It is, in fact, an economic enabler. Thanks.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I don't see any further hands for questions. Then we're going to end the briefing here. Thank you so much for joining us, and to those on the live stream, thank you so much for tuning in. If you need any further information regarding the DA's alternative budget, you can just check out our social media pages. Thank you.